The diner was quiet, the kind of quiet that fools you. A 9-year-old girl sat alone in her wheelchair by the window, watching snow fall on an empty parking lot. She wasn't bothering anyone. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just waiting. 4 teenagers decided that was enough of a reason. The whispers started soft. The laughter followed, and a retired Marine 3 tables away heard every word and didn't move. Neither did his dog. What happened next inside that frozen Colorado diner would be captured on camera, shared across the country, and change 4 lives before noon. If you've never subscribed to this channel, this is the story that will make you. Hit that button now, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this one travels. The exit sign above the diner door had been flickering for at least 3 winters, and nobody had bothered to fix it. That was Ethan Mercer's first observation when he pulled off Highway 24 at 6:47 in the morning, his truck's heater finally giving out somewhere past Woodland Park. The parking lot of the Silver Ridge Sunrise Diner held 7 vehicles, 2 pickups, a semi with Missouri plates, a minivan with a cracked windshield, and a sedan with its hazards blinking weakly near the handicapped space. The sedan's hood was up. Steam or exhaust, he couldn't tell which, drifted up from the engine in a thin white column that disappeared into the gray sky. Ethan sat in his truck for a moment after cutting the engine. Old habit. 12 years of entering rooms that could go wrong had wired something into the back of his brain that never fully switched off. Not paranoia, exactly, just attention. He scanned the lot without moving his head, the way they'd trained him to do in the desert, eyes moving, body still, giving nothing away. The blinking hazards on the sedan bothered him. Not in a dangerous way, in a human way. Someone was having a bad morning out here in the cold. He climbed out, and Shadow climbed out after him. The dog was 9 years old, which in German Shepherd years put him somewhere in the neighborhood of distinguished. His muzzle had gone silver over the last 2 deployments, or what would have been deployments if they'd still been going. His harness still fit the same as it had in Kandahar. Snug across the chest, the retired military working dog patch faded but intact on the left panel. Shadow moved the way he always moved, which was deliberately and without wasted motion, staying slightly behind Ethan's left shoulder, his amber eyes cataloging the lot the same way Ethan's were. "Cold one," Ethan muttered, not really to the dog. Shadow's ears ticked forward anyway. They went inside. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease and something vaguely institutional, like a school cafeteria that had reinvented itself. The floors were black and white checkered tile, worn smooth in the traffic paths near the counter. A hand-painted wooden sign above the register said, "Silver Ridge Sunrise," in blue letters that had started to peel. Merle Haggard was playing low from a speaker someone had duct taped to the top of the refrigeration unit. Ethan took the booth farthest from the door. Another old habit, and not one he'd ever fully explained to anyone who'd asked about it. He sat with his back to the wall, facing the room. Shadow settled on the floor beside him, head on his paws, eyes still moving. A waitress materialized, mid-50s, hair pinned up, a name tag that said Donna in black block letters. She looked at Shadow the way most people did, a half-second of surprise, then professional recalibration. "He's a retired service dog," Ethan said before she could ask. "He clean?" "Cleaner than I am." That bought him a small smile. "Coffee?" "Please, and whatever the egg special is." "It's eggs." "Perfect." She left, and Ethan settled back against the booth, rolling the tension out of his left shoulder. He'd been driving since 4 in the morning, coming down from Denver after 3 days of paperwork and transition assistance meetings that hadn't assisted him with much of anything. The VA counselor, a young guy named Philip, who had never served and was very enthusiastic about self-care worksheets, had given him a folder full of resources and a handshake that lasted too long. Ethan had thanked him anyway. Civilian life was full of people trying very hard. He noticed the girl by the window when Donna brought his coffee. She was maybe 8 or 9, sitting in a motorized wheelchair positioned at a 2-top table near the window. She had dark hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail that someone had clearly helped her with and had done their best with. She was wearing a purple coat with a small patch of something, a cartoon dog maybe, stitched on the left chest. On the table in front of her was a coloring book, open to a page of a jungle scene. She was coloring a parrot, bright, furious red with a crayon gripped in both hands, concentrating the way kids concentrate when they're trying very hard not to think about something else. She was alone. Ethan glanced toward the parking lot through the window, the sedan with the blinking hazards. He made the connection. He looked back at the girl. She hadn't noticed him. She kept coloring, bearing down on the red crayon until it started to shorten under the pressure. And she didn't look up at the door, and she didn't look up at the parking lot. And it occurred to him that she had probably been told not to worry, that Mom would be right back, that everything was fine. She was trying very hard to believe it. The four teenagers came in at 7:03. Ethan knew the time because he'd checked his watch when the door opened and the temperature of the room dropped by about 2 degrees. Not from the cold air outside, from something else. The kind of social pressure that arrives before it announces itself. They were 17, maybe 18. 3 boys and a girl. The kind of group that had probably been together since middle school, long enough to develop a shared shorthand, a collective confidence that came from never having been individually challenged. They were dressed well, not Silver Ridge dressed, something more urban, the kind of clothes that people wore to signal they were just passing through places like this. North Face jackets, expensive sneakers that were completely wrong for Colorado winter. They took the large booth 2 tables over from Lucy. Ethan watched them the way he watched everything, without appearing to. For the first few minutes, they were just loud. Not aggressively loud, teenager loud. The volume of people who've never been told to turn it down in a way that stuck. They ordered without looking at Donna. They talked over each other, and one of them, the biggest one, a thick-necked boy with a baseball cap worn backwards, kept making his friends laugh by saying things just under the register of being clearly overheard. Then one of them noticed Lucy. It was the girl in the group. She had the kind of face that could go either way, pretty in a studied, self-conscious way, the kind that becomes mean when it needs an audience. She spotted Lucy, and something shifted in her expression. Not cruelty, not exactly, not yet, just recognition of opportunity. She said something to the others, low. Ethan caught only fragments, the word wheelchair, and then a sound effect that made the others laugh. Lucy kept coloring, but her crayons slowed down. It started with the looks. They were theatrical about it in the way only people who believe they're invisible are theatrical. Exaggerated double takes, whispered commentary, suppressed laughter that they didn't suppress all that hard. The big kid with the cap pulled out his phone and held it up at an angle. Not obviously pointed at Lucy, but pointed. Ethan set down his coffee cup. Shadow's head came up off his paws. The thing about bullying, in Ethan's experience, and he had more experience with cruelty than he'd ever wanted, was that it operated on the same tactical principle as most forms of coercion. It relied on the assumption that nobody was paying enough attention to call it what it was. The whispers stayed whispers. The laughter stayed just below the threshold of obvious. Everything was deniable. We were just talking. We were just joking. We didn't mean anything by it. The maintenance of that deniability required witnesses who looked away. Ethan did not look away. He watched the girl in the group lean forward and say something to the others in a voice that carried just enough. Something about the wheelchair, something about the coloring book, and then something else. He didn't catch the specific words, but he caught the specific cruelty of them from the way Lucy's shoulders came up around her ears. The crayon stopped moving entirely. Lucy was staring at the parrot she'd been coloring. Her knuckles had gone white around the crayon. She didn't look up at them, and that was somehow worse. A child who had already learned that looking up was never worth it. Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow was already looking at him. I didn't say anything. He didn't stand up. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, and while he did, he examined the room the way he would have examined a room in Fallujah, or the Korengal, or any of the dozen other places where the first question was always, who else knows what's happening here? The semi-driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a Teamster's patch on his jacket, was reading something on his phone, but his jaw had tightened twice in the last 2 minutes. He knew. Donna knew. She was avoiding that corner of the room with the specific deliberateness of someone who'd made the calculation that involvement wasn't worth the fallout. An older couple near the counter, matching gray parkas, probably retired, had stopped talking to each other. The man was looking at his eggs. The woman was looking at the window. Neither was looking at the teenagers. Both were listening. They all knew. They were all deciding that it wasn't their business. Ethan understood the logic. He'd used it himself. in airports and grocery stores and parking lots, when his body said, "Not my fight," and his brain agreed. There was nothing cowardly about the calculus. It was just the math of a public space, the average person's reasonable reluctance to become a target in someone else's crossfire. He understood it. He rejected it. He stood up. Shadow stood up with him, smooth and without drama, like they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, which, in some sense, they had. Ethan walked across the diner, not toward the teenagers, but toward Lucy's table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He rested both forearms on the table. He looked at the coloring book. "That's a good red," he said. Lucy looked up, startled. She had brown eyes, wide and careful, eyes that had been trained by experience to assess adults quickly. "It's a scarlet macaw," she said after a moment. "They're actually not that red in real life. They have yellow and blue too, but I like the red part best." "Smart bird," Ethan said. "Smart enough to get out of cold places." A ghost of a smile. "We're in Colorado." Exactly my point. Shadow had moved on his own. No command, no hand signal. He had walked slowly and without urgency from Ethan's booth, past the edge of Lucy's table, and positioned himself between her and the teenager's booth. He sat. He didn't look at the teenagers. He didn't growl. He didn't do anything that could be described as threatening. He simply occupied the space between them and her, 90 pounds of silver and black German shepherd, utterly still, utterly calm, his amber eyes moving across the room with the mild interest of someone who had stopped caring about impressing people a long time ago. The laughter at the teenagers' table stopped, not because they were afraid exactly, or not only that, it was the sudden visibility, the moment when a behavior that had been performed under cover of inattention found itself clearly observed, clearly framed, and fully reflected back. The girl who'd started it, Ethan had started thinking of her as the architect, recovered first. "Cool dog," she said, in a voice that was trying to be casual and missing by several feet. Ethan looked at her for the first time directly. He didn't say anything. He had learned, in 12 years of operating in environments where words could start firefights, that silence lands differently than any response. A response acknowledges an argument's terms. Silence dismantles them. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, not hostile, not warm, simply present, and then looked back at Lucy's coloring book. "What are you going to color next?" he asked. Lucy glanced at the teenagers, then back at him. Something had shifted in her face. The braced quality around her eyes had loosened slightly. "The jaguar," she said. "I haven't decided what color yet. They're usually spotted." "Spotted sounds right." The sound of activity at the teenagers' table resumed, but it was different now. Quieter, self-conscious, the laughter calibrated to a lower frequency. They had become aware of themselves in a way they hadn't been before. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase what they'd already said. But it changed the architecture of the room. Donna refilled Ethan's coffee without being asked. When she passed the teenagers' table, she didn't look at them either. But she set the check down in front of the big kid, face up, which was a statement. That was when the manager came out of the back. He was a narrow man in his 40s, wearing a Silver Ridge Sunrise polo shirt that was slightly too large for him. His name tag said Gary. He had the look of someone who had been told something by one of his staff and had come out to handle it before it became something he'd have to write a report about. He stopped at the edge of Lucy's table. He looked at Shadow. He looked at Ethan. "Sir?" he said, in the voice of someone who has practiced de-escalation in a corporate training module. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove the animal. We have health code considerations." "He's a federally protected service animal," Ethan said, without looking up from the coloring book. "Retired military working dog. The Americans with Disabilities Act. He's not your service animal, though." Ethan looked up at that. Gary held his ground, but barely. "I mean, he's not currently assigned to you or this table. I'm not trying to make a problem." "Good," Ethan said. "Then we're agreed." There was a silence. Gary looked around the room in the helpless way of authority figures who have just discovered the room is not with them. The Teamster's driver had put his phone down. The older couple had turned around on their stools. Donna had stopped pretending to wipe the counter. "Sir, I need you to—" "My daughter doesn't like being alone." The voice came from the direction of Lucy's table, but from Lucy herself. Quiet, steady, directed at Gary without flinching. Gary blinked. She's scared, Lucy said. When he leaves, they start again. The room was silent. Not the restaurant kind of silent, where the music fills in. The actual kind, where the music doesn't matter because everyone has stopped. The teenagers had gone very still. Gary's mouth opened, then closed. And then the door to the diner opened, and the cold air came in, and with it came a woman, mid-30s, still wearing her work scrubs under an unzipped coat, hair coming loose, eyes scanning the room with the specific desperation of a parent who has walked back into a space she left her child in and can feel something is wrong before she's processed a single specific detail. Rachel Hale stopped just inside the door. Her eyes found Lucy first, the way a mother's eyes always do. Then she found Shadow, then Ethan, then the teenagers. Then she found her daughter's face. Rachel Hale had the eyes of someone who had been afraid for so long that fear had become a kind of background frequency, always there, just below the surface of every ordinary moment. She'd learned to function through it, to smile at Lucy's teachers, to laugh at the nurse's station, to drive home at midnight after double shifts and still make pancakes on Saturday mornings. She had built an entire life around not letting the fear show. It showed now. She crossed the diner in 6 steps, crouched beside Lucy's wheelchair, and took her daughter's face in both hands the way you hold something you came very close to losing. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked, checking, cataloging, running the silent inventory that parents run when they've been away from their children, and something in the air tells them the absence costs something. "Baby," she said. "Hey, look at me." "I'm okay," Lucy said. "I know, I can see that." Rachel's voice was controlled, measured, the voice of a woman who had spent years talking patients down from ledges of panic. But her hands were shaking slightly where they held Lucy's face, and she couldn't quite make that stop. "I'm going to need you to tell me what happened." Lucy glanced at Ethan. Rachel followed the glance. She straightened up slowly and looked at Ethan across the table. At the man sitting in the chair she hadn't put there, with the coffee that wasn't his table's, across from her daughter, who was supposed to have been alone. Her assessment was quick and practiced, the kind nurses develop after years of sizing up strangers in crisis situations. She took in the short-cropped hair, the unremarkable jacket that couldn't quite hide the particular way military men held their shoulders, the stillness, the dog positioned at the edge of the table like a sentry. "Who are you?" she said. Not hostile, but not soft either. "Ethan Mercer. I was sitting over there." He gestured toward the far booth without drama. "I moved when it seemed like a good idea." Rachel looked at Shadow, then at the teenagers' table. 2 of them were looking at their phones with the concentrated attention of people actively trying to appear uninterested in something. The girl, the one who had started it, though Rachel didn't know that yet, was stirring her coffee in slow circles, her eyes down. "What happened?" Rachel asked again, this time to the room rather than to anyone specific. Nobody answered immediately. The Teamster's driver put down his phone. He was a big man, 50-something, with a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in a while and a jacket that had seen more weather than most buildings. He cleared his throat. "Those kids over there," he said, nodding toward the teenager's booth without looking at them, "had some things to say about your daughter. Started about 10-15 minutes ago. Wasn't loud enough to get thrown out, but was loud enough that everybody in here heard it." Rachel went very still. "The dog moved over there on his own," the driver continued. "Didn't do nothing, just sat down between them and her. The man followed." Rachel looked back at Ethan. Something complicated moved across her face. Gratitude, and underneath it, the particular exhaustion of a parent who has had this conversation too many times, in too many forms, with too many explanations of why her child was an acceptable target. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out frayed at the edges. "You don't need to thank me." "I do." She said it with a finality that closed that door. She turned back to Lucy. "Did anyone touch you?" The pause that followed was a half-second too long. Rachel's jaw set. "It was an accident," Lucy said quickly, and the fact that she said that, the fact that her first instinct was to minimize, to protect someone who had hurt her, landed in Ethan's chest like a small, sharp weight. The table moved and... loose. "The big one bumped my chair," Lucy said quietly, when he walked past. He said sorry, but he was laughing when he said it. The room shifted again. Not dramatically. Just a degree or two of recalibration, The way the air in a space changes when the thing everyone had been carefully not naming finally gets named. Gary, who had been standing at the periphery of all this with the frozen expression of a man watching a situation migrate far outside his training, cleared his throat. "Ms. Hale," Rachel said without looking at him. Rachel Hale. "My daughter was in your establishment being harassed while I was in your parking lot dealing with a dead battery, and I'd very much like to know what you're planning to do about it." "We weren't, nothing was reported to me until—" "Nothing was reported," Rachel repeated. She said it the way you repeat something when you want the full weight of it to settle before you continue. "There were 10 people in this room." Gary's mouth opened and closed. "There's a camera," Donna said. Everyone looked at her. The waitress had come around from behind the counter and was standing at the edge of the cluster with her arms folded and the look of a woman who had made a decision. She pointed up at the corner of the room where a small gray security camera angled down toward the dining area from above the specials board. "Gary's had it for 2 years, has video going back 30 days. Gary looked at the camera with the expression of a man who had completely forgotten the camera existed and was only now calculating what it had seen. Rachel said, "I want to see it. I don't know if I can just—" "Your establishment, my daughter." A physical contact she's describing as intentional. Rachel's voice had shifted into something quieter and more dangerous than anger. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Gary. I file incident reports for a living. I know exactly what documentation looks like and exactly what the absence of it looks like. So you can show me the footage now, or you can explain to your franchise manager why you didn't." Gary looked at the camera again, at Rachel, at the teenager's table. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. He retreated into the back office. The room settled into an uneasy interim. Rachel pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat next to Lucy, and Lucy leaned the side of her head against her mother's shoulder without ceremony, the unconscious way of children who have been frightened but won't say so. Rachel kept her hand on the back of Lucy's wheelchair, the specific grip of someone making sure a thing stays exactly where it is. Ethan stayed at the table. He hadn't been invited to leave or to stay, and he'd learned long ago that ambiguous situations resolved themselves faster when you didn't force them. He finished his coffee. Shadow remained at his post between the tables, patient as topography. The teenagers had stopped performing. That was the word that came to Ethan's mind. Performing. Because that was what it had been. Every whisper, every exaggerated reaction, every carefully aimed comment had been a performance calibrated for an audience of each other, each cruelty amplified by the approval of the next person in the group. Pull the audience away, and the whole structure deflated. They were just 4 kids in a diner now, 2 of them on their phones, 1 of them staring at the table, and the architect, the girl, watching the back office door with an expression that had moved from studied boredom through anxiety and was now settling somewhere in the vicinity of genuine concern. The big kid with the backwards cap, Ethan had revised his age estimate up to 18, leaned across the table and said something in a low voice. The girl shook her head, a tight, abbreviated motion. He said something else. She shook her head again. Ethan watched Shadow watch them. The dog's ears were tracking the conversation at the teenager's table, the way they'd tracked voices in vehicles approaching checkpoints. Not aggressive, not alarmed, just attentive. Cataloging. Shadow had spent 3 years learning to distinguish between people who were nervous because they were in a new place and people who were nervous because they'd done something. He'd been right more often than most of the censors the Corps had thrown money at. The Teamsters driver, Ethan had clocked the name patch on his jacket, as Dale had gone back to his coffee but was sitting sideways in his stool, his body language making clear he was available if available became necessary. The older couple had ordered refills and were talking again, but slowly, and the man kept his chair angled toward the room. Small adjustments, the kind people make when they've decided, without discussing it, that they're witnesses now. Donna refilled Lucy's hot chocolate without being asked. She set it down, and her hand rested briefly on the coloring book, a small, deliberate gesture that wasn't quite a pat and wasn't quite an apology but was somewhere in between. Lucy looked up. "Thank you." "Honey," Donna said, "you color that Jaguar whatever color you want." Gary came back out after 8 minutes, not 5. He was carrying a laptop, and his face had changed. The corporate de-escalation expression was gone. In its place was something simpler and less comfortable, say, the face of a person who has just watched something on a screen and cannot unsee it. He set the laptop on the counter and turned it so Rachel could see. Rachel watched the footage with the focused attention of someone who examines things clinically for a living. Her expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The footage was doing all the work. Ethan couldn't see the screen from where he was sitting, but he could see Rachel's face, and he could see Gary's face, and he could see, peripherally, that the architect had gone pale. The footage ran for approximately 3 minutes. Rachel watched without speaking. At one point, she closed her eyes briefly. Not from distress, but from the specific response of a person confirming something they had already known and had hoped was wrong. Then she opened them and kept watching. When it was over, she stepped back from the counter. "Okay," she said. The word was quiet and very flat. Gary turned the laptop toward the teenager's table. "I need you all to come up here," he said. The big kid started to say something. "Look, we were just—" And Gary cut him off in a way that surprised Ethan, because it suggested Gary had more spine than the previous 10 minutes had indicated. "I said come up here." They came. All 4 of them, filing out of the booth with the specific reluctant compliance of people who have just realized the situation is past the point where confidence helps. They stood in a row in front of the counter, and Gary turned the laptop so they could see the frozen frame on the screen. The moment where the angle caught the big kid's shoulder connecting with Lucy's wheelchair, and the reaction on his face was clearly not surprise, and the reaction on the girl's face 2 seconds later was clearly amusement. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the architect said, "That's not what it looks like." It was the wrong thing to say. Ethan knew it was the wrong thing to say before the last word was out of her mouth, and from the slight tension in Rachel's shoulders, Rachel knew it too. "Excuse me?" Rachel said. "We didn't—" The girl stopped, restarted. "We were just— It was a joke. We weren't trying to hurt anyone." Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger, something that was, in some ways, harder to receive than anger. "My daughter is 9 years old," Rachel said. "She has spinal muscular atrophy. She will spend her entire life in that chair. People will look at her in parking lots, in restaurants, in schools, in every room she enters for the rest of her life. And they will make a decision about who she is in the first 3 seconds based on what they see. And some of those people," her voice stayed level, stayed controlled, "will decide that she's a target because she can't run, because she can't follow them, because they think no one is paying attention." The girl looked at the counter. Her jaw was tight. "What was the joke?" Rachel asked. No answer. "I'd like to hear it. If it was funny enough that you were still laughing about it 5 minutes in, I'd like to hear what was so funny." The room was completely silent. "That's what I thought," Rachel said. Gary cleared his throat. I was sweating slightly. "I'm going to have to ask you all to leave. I'll be retaining this footage, and if any of you have contact with anyone in this establishment going forward—" "We're from Denver," the big kid said. "We're just passing through." He said it like it was an explanation for something, like geography modified responsibility. "Then keep passing," Dale said from his stool, without turning around. They left. Not dramatically. There was no door slamming, no parting shot, no final attempt at reclaiming dignity. The big kid put on his jacket first, and the others followed, and they walked out in a loose cluster through the front door, and the bell above the door made its small aluminum sound, and then they were gone. Through the window, Ethan watched them cross the parking lot toward a dark SUV. The architect got in the passenger seat without looking back at the diner. The SUV pulled out and turned north on the highway, and within 30 seconds it had disappeared around the curve. The diner exhaled. It happened collectively, and without anyone deciding to do it. Shoulders dropped, coffee cups were picked back up. The ambient noise of flatware against ceramic resumed. Merle Haggard was still playing. Dale rotated back to face the counter. The older couple resumed their conversation. Donna went back behind the register and picked up where she'd left off. Rachel stood at the counter for another moment, her hands flat on the surface, her head slightly bowed. Then she straightened, and the nurse's composure came back up like a curtain, and she walked back to Lucy's table and sat down. "Okay," she said again, differently this time. "Okay," Lucy agreed. Shadow had moved. He was no longer between the tables. That position had served its purpose. He had relocated to the side of Lucy's wheelchair and was sitting with his shoulder against the wheel, not demanding attention, simply present. Lucy's hand had found the top of his head at some point, her fingers resting in his fur with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has always known that dogs understand more than they're supposed to. Rachel looked at the dog, then at Ethan. "She asked you to sit down?" Rachel asked. "Or you just—" "I just did," Ethan said. Rachel nodded slowly. "And the dog?" "I didn't tell him to do anything. He made his own call." She looked at Shadow again with the complicated expression of someone trying to fit a thing into a framework it doesn't quite fit. "He's been in combat." It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered it anyway. 3 deployments. Helmand, then Kandahar twice. He's better at reading rooms than most people I know. "Is he retired because of injury or age?" "Both." Ethan paused. Shrapnel caught him in the left rear quarter in 21. He recovered fine, but the Corps doesn't keep them past the point where they might hesitate, because hesitation gets people killed. He had a good run. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about you?" Ethan looked at his coffee cup. "I didn't get shrapnel." "That's not what I asked." He looked up. Rachel's eyes were steady and professionally neutral in the way that very good nurses learn to be. She wasn't prying, exactly. She was assessing, in the same way she'd assessed him when she walked through the door. The difference was that now the emergency was over and she had bandwidth for the secondary questions. "I'm fine," he said. She didn't push it. She had the good sense to know when a door wasn't going to open, and the grace not to stand in front of it. "We're going to Silver Ridge," Lucy announced, apparently feeling the conversation had moved on enough for her to rejoin it. "My mom is working there for 6 months, at the hospital. They needed nurses." "I know Silver Ridge," Ethan said. "Do you live there?" "I'm passing through it. I live in Durango, or I will. I'm heading back after—" He paused, searching for a clean way to describe the last 3 days and finding none. "Some paperwork." "Paperwork," Lucy repeated, in the tone of a 9-year-old confirming that adults were, in fact, as boring as advertised. "The exciting kind. There's no exciting kind of paperwork." "That's fair," Ethan admitted. Lucy looked at Shadow. "Can I give him something? Mom, can I—" "Ask Mr. Mercer." Lucy looked at Ethan with the specific, focused hope of a child making a request. "They're not sure we'll land." "Can he have a piece of my toast? I didn't finish it." Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow was looking at the toast with the serene and patient expression of a professional who had learned not to let enthusiasm compromise composure, but was composure compromised right now. "Marginally." "Quarter piece," Ethan said. "No butter." Lucy broke a careful quarter from the dry side and held it out. Shadow took it from her hand with extraordinary delicacy. Lips only, no teeth, the way they'd trained him to take things from hands that might be injured. Lucy's face broke open into a real smile for the first time since Ethan had walked in. Rachel watched her daughter, and something in her own face did the same. Gary came back out of the back office a second time with a printed receipt, which he placed in front of Rachel. She looked at it. He had comped the entire table, Rachel's coffee, Lucy's hot chocolate and toast, and notably, Ethan's eggs and coffee as well, which were listed on the receipt with a line through them. "It's the least I can do," Gary said, with the sincerity of a man making a small amend and knowing it's small. "And I want you to know, I flagged this incident. My district manager will see the footage." Rachel folded the receipt. "Thank you, Gary. I should have done something sooner." He said it to the room, not specifically to Rachel or Ethan, which was perhaps more honest than a direct statement would have been. "I wasn't sure what I was seeing." "Now you know what it looks like," Dale said from the counter. Gary looked at him, nodded once, went back behind the counter. Donna appeared at Ethan's elbow with the coffee pot. He shook his head. He'd been nursing the same cup for 40 minutes and probably needed to get back on the road before the temperature dropped further. She filled it anyway, a small act of insistence, and he accepted it. Rachel was watching him again. "You were just getting breakfast," she said. "That was the plan, yeah." "And instead you—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at the morning, at the complicated series of events that had unfolded between his arrival and this moment. "I had breakfast," Ethan said. "Just with better company than usual." Lucy looked up from the Jaguar she had resumed coloring. She'd decided on orange with black spots, which was not technically accurate and was exactly right. "Shadow is the best company," she said. "He'd agree with you. Ethan said, but he'd think it went without saying. Rachel's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, looked at the screen, and her expression shifted into the particular version of tired that parents wear when logistics reassert themselves after a crisis. "The tow truck is 15 minutes out," she said. "They're going to take it to a shop in Silver Ridge, which means we need to—" She looked at Lucy, then at the window, then at her watch. "We could wait here," Lucy said. "It's cold in the car, baby. They're not going to want us standing in the lot." "We could wait here," Lucy said again, with the clarifying patience of a child who means the diner, not the parking lot. Rachel blinked, looked at Gary. Gary, apparently having decided that this morning was going to cost him something, and he might as well choose what, said, "Take all the time you need." Rachel settled. The tension in her shoulders didn't leave entirely, but it found a lower altitude. Outside, the snow that had been threatening since Ethan pulled off the highway had made up its mind. It was coming down in the small, dry flakes that Colorado produced in January. Not the dramatic kind, not the photogenic kind, but the kind that accumulated quietly and made roads unfamiliar and exits complicated. Ethan looked at the window. He looked at the highway. He thought about Durango, about the apartment he'd signed a lease on in September and visited exactly once, about the VA counselor's folder of resources sitting in the footwell of his truck. He thought about Lucy coloring a macaw red because she liked the red part best. He picked up his coffee. Rachel had gone quiet, in the way of people who are managing multiple calculations simultaneously. The car, the tow, the hospital shift she was already reshaping around this morning's detour, and underneath all of it, the residue of having come back into a room and understood in 3 seconds that her daughter had spent the last half hour afraid while she was 30 feet away in the parking lot, powerless over a dead battery and completely unaware. That was the part that would stay with her, not the teenagers. They would fade into a category of people she'd already encountered and would encounter again. It was the powerlessness. The 30 feet. She rubbed her thumb across the back of Lucy's hand. Lucy didn't look up from the Jaguar, but she turned her hand over and held her mother's. Ethan looked away, toward the window, giving them that. Outside, the snow kept falling. A semi coming down from the pass had its hazards on, the amber lights blinking in the white-gray morning, slow and steady, the rhythm of a vehicle that knew the road was worse than it looked and was saying so to everyone behind it. Shadow had moved again. He was lying down now, fully down, Sphinx position, his head up and his eyes on the room, which was his signal, always had been, for situations that had passed the acute phase. In the field, it had meant the sweep was done, the perimeter was secure, you could breathe. It meant the immediate danger has passed. It did not mean everything is fine. Ethan knew the difference. There was something still in this room that hadn't resolved. He could feel it the way he'd learned to feel the particular atmospheric pressure of a situation that looked concluded but wasn't. The way a room could look cleared and still have something moving in it. He glanced at Gary, who was on the phone in the back, turned away, speaking quietly. He glanced at Donna, who was watching the back office door. He looked at the security camera in the corner. He'd assumed the footage would go no further than this room, this morning, Gary's district manager, a note in a file somewhere. That was the reasonable assumption. That was how these things usually worked. Contained, local, documented, and then forgotten, the way most cruelties were. He didn't know, sitting there with his second cup of coffee and the dry Colorado snow falling outside, that Gary's phone call was not to the district manager. He didn't know that Gary's district manager had a brother-in-law who worked for a veterans advocacy organization in Colorado Springs, and that Gary, shaken by what he'd seen on that monitor, was calling his brother-in-law because he didn't know who else to call and needed to tell someone who would understand what he'd watched on that screen. He didn't know any of that yet. He was just a man in a diner finishing his coffee, watching the snow. Shadow's ears moved first. One ear swiveled toward the back office, a fraction of a degree, tracking something Ethan's human ears hadn't caught yet. Then Shadow's head came up off his paws, just slightly, reassessing. Ethan set down his cup. "What is it?" Rachel asked quietly. She'd seen the dog move. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was listening. From the back office, Gary's voice, muffled through the door but audible in its urgency, said a single phrase that carried through the thin wall clearly enough to understand. "The whole thing is on camera, I'm telling you, from start to finish. You need to see it." Ethan heard it clearly the second time. Gary's voice through the office wall, tighter now, more urgent. "No, I'm saying you need to see the actual footage. I can send it right now. You tell me who to send it to. Rachel had gone still beside Lucy. Not the stillness of someone relaxed, the stillness of someone listening with their entire body. The way you listened when a situation you thought had concluded was demonstrating that it hadn't. Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow was already looking at the door. The dog had his head up and his ears forward, not in alarm but in the specific posture of attentive uncertainty, the one that meant something is still moving in this room and I have not been told what to do about it. In the field, that posture had preceded either a stand down or a contact, and you didn't know which until the next 30 seconds resolved it. The office door opened. Gary came out looking like a man who had made a decision and was not entirely sure it had been the right one. He was holding his phone against his chest, screen in, the way people held their phones when they were protecting information they weren't sure they should have shared. He stopped at the edge of the counter and looked at Ethan with an expression that was part apology and part something else. Something that looked almost like excitement, which was strange, because nothing about Gary's morning had been exciting in any good way. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Ethan waited. "I called my brother-in-law. He works with the Colorado Veterans Community Coalition. It's an advocacy organization. They work with... Anyway, he wants to talk to you. If you're willing." Ethan didn't move. "About what?" "About what happened this morning. About the footage." Gary took a breath. He said he needs to forward it to someone who's been looking for exactly this kind of... "I'm not interested in being a story," Ethan said. The word story landed in the room and everyone heard it. And what it meant was, I didn't do this so someone could film it, and I'm not interested in whatever version of this you're constructing in your head right now. Gary nodded, absorbing that. "He said you'd probably say that. He said tell you, it's not about you, it's about the program." "What program?" Gary looked slightly uncomfortable. "He said he'd rather explain it himself. 5 minutes on the phone. That's all he's asking." Ethan looked at the window. The snow was coming down harder now, steady and purposeful. His truck was out there. Durango was 4 hours south. He had nothing waiting for him except an empty apartment and a folder of resources he wasn't going to use. He looked at Lucy, who had stopped coloring again and was watching him with the openly curious attention of a child who has learned that interesting things happen when you watch adults closely enough. 5 minutes, he said. Done. Gary handed him the phone and retreated to the far end of the counter with the tact of a man who understood he had already been more involved in this than his job description required. The voice on the other end was brisk and businesslike, with an undercurrent of genuine urgency that Ethan recognized. The voice of someone who had been working toward a thing for long enough that patience had worn thin at the edges. "Mr. Mercer, my name is Thomas Vega. I appreciate you taking the call." Gary said 5 minutes. "I'll use 4. A pause, the kind that suggested Vega was accustomed to making cases quickly. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide it doesn't apply to you. There's a man named Victor Reynolds, Colonel, retired, out of Peterson Air Force Base. He's been developing a community de-escalation initiative for 2 years. Veteran facilitated, service dogs involved. The model is about presence and intervention before conflict becomes violence. Schools, public spaces, vulnerable populations. He has buy-in from the governor's office. He has funding sitting in an account, and he has been looking for the right case study to justify rolling it out statewide." Ethan said nothing. "What I'm looking at right now," Vega continued, "is a 47-second clip of a retired military working dog creating a de-escalation perimeter around a child in a wheelchair without any command from his handler. And his handler sitting down across from that child and doing exactly nothing confrontational for 22 minutes while the situation resolved. A beat. You understand what I'm saying? I understand what you're saying. I'm telling you that's not what happened. What happened is I got breakfast and my dog sat down. Mr. Mercer, I'm not being falsely modest. I'm telling you the truth. I didn't execute a de-escalation strategy. I didn't intervene as part of a program. I sat down because a kid was scared, and my dog moved because that's what he does." "I know," Vega said. "That's exactly why Reynolds needs to see it." The line hummed for a moment. "He's not going to put you on television," Vega said. "He's not going to make you a spokesperson. What he wants, what he's been unable to manufacture in 2 years of program design, is proof that this works when it's real. That the presence model functions in an unscripted civilian environment. That a veteran and a trained animal can walk into an ordinary room and shift the dynamic without a single act of aggression. Ethan rubbed his face with his free hand. He needed a shower and more coffee and 4 hours of highway, in that order. "Tell Reynolds he can see the footage," he said. "That's Gary's call, not mine. My name stays out of it. He'll want to talk to you. Then he can find me." He handed the phone back to Gary. "I didn't give him permission to share my information." Gary took the phone carefully, the way you take a thing from someone when you're not sure if they're done being angry yet. "Understood." "I'm not angry," Ethan said, reading the caution. "I just need to be clear." "You're clear." Gary pocketed the phone. "Thank you for this morning. All of it." Ethan picked up his jacket from the booth he'd abandoned 40 minutes ago. Shadow rose when he did, automatic and synchronized, the seamless response of two bodies that had operated together long enough to share a sense of timing. He was zipping his jacket when Rachel said, "The tow truck is here." The truck was a battered F-350 with Ridge Auto stenciled on the door in fading white paint. The driver, a young guy, maybe 22, with the perpetually wind-burned complexion of someone who spent more time outside than in, was already hooking up the chains when Ethan pushed through the diner's front door into the cold. He stopped. Standing next to the tow driver, in the parking lot of the Silver Ridge Sunrise Diner, looking at the footage on Gary's forwarded phone, with the focused intensity of someone who watched things very carefully for a living, was a man Ethan had never met and immediately recognized the shape of. Tall, late 50s, the particular physical economy of career military, no wasted movement, no performative posture, just a body that had learned to occupy space efficiently. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, nothing that announced anything. But you could have put him in a grocery store in Des Moines and Ethan still would have known inside of 10 seconds. Some things didn't wash out. He looked up from the phone when Ethan came through the door. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Ethan stopped on the top step. "You move fast." "I was already in Woodland Park. Thomas Vega is very good at his job." The man pocketed Gary's phone, which he apparently had in his possession, which meant Gary had done considerably more than forward the footage, and walked to the base of the steps. Victor Reynolds. He didn't extend his hand, which was a choice, and a considered one. Instead, he looked at Shadow, who was standing at Ethan's left shoulder regarding Reynolds with the same equable attention he gave most things. "What was his designation?" Reynolds asked. "K-147. His working name was Shade." "What'd you call him?" "Shadow." "I didn't seem to care about the difference." Reynolds nodded slightly, the acknowledgement of someone who understood that these things mattered, and that how you talked about them told you something. He looked at the dog for another moment. "Helmand Province?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You read fast, too." "Thomas told me what you told him." Reynolds looked up from the dog. His eyes were gray and direct without being hard. The eyes of a man who had spent decades making assessments and had gotten honest about which ones he'd gotten wrong. "I'm not here to recruit you. I'm not here to make you a case study. I came because I wanted to see the dog." That was unexpected. Ethan said nothing and waited. "I've been designing a program on paper for 2 years, Reynolds said. Veteran-facilitated community intervention. Service animals as de-escalation presence. The theory is solid. The research is solid. What I've been missing is the thing you can't manufacture in a controlled environment." He paused. "Do you know what that is?" "Instinct," Ethan said. "Trust," Reynolds said, "between the handler and the animal. The kind you can't train in 6 weeks and you can't fake on a demonstration day." He looked at Shadow again. That dog made a tactical decision in public civilian space. No command, no signal. He assessed the threat, determined the appropriate response, and positioned himself between the vulnerable party and the source of harm without any aggression that would have escalated the situation. He paused. "How long did it take him?" 4 seconds, Ethan said, from when the girl's shoulders went up. Reynolds was quiet. He was reading her, Ethan said, because he could see Reynolds processing it and wanted him to have the accurate version, not the teenagers. He was watching the target, the one being affected. And when her body language hit a threshold, he moved. He didn't wait for an overt act. He moved on the early signal. "That's what I saw on the footage." Reynolds looked up at Ethan. "And he got that from?" From 3 years of watching me do it. Ethan said it without particular pride, the way you state a fact about a mechanism. Patrol doctrine. You watch the civilian population, not the threat. The threat is self-announcing. The civilian population tells you what the threat has already done. Reynolds let that sit for a moment. The tow truck driver had finished with the chains and was doing something with a lever on the back of the F-350, and Rachel had come through the diner door with Lucy's wheelchair and was navigating the handicapped ramp with practiced efficiency. Her attention split between her daughter and the logistics of the sedan, and she had not yet noticed Reynolds, which gave Ethan approximately 30 more seconds of this conversation before the variables multiplied. "What exactly do you want?" Ethan asked. "I want you to meet with me for 2 hours next week. No commitment, no agreement, no cameras. I want to tell you what the program looks like and why I think what happened this morning is the proof of concept I've been missing." Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, which he held out. "If you're not interested after 2 hours, I shake your hand and you go back to Durango." Ethan looked at the card. Plain white. Name, rank, phone number, the seal of a nonprofit he didn't recognize. "How do you know I'm going to Durango?" "I don't know anything about you, Mr. Mercer. Thomas told me your name, your dog's designation, and your last duty station. That's all I have." Reynolds held the card steady. "Everything else? I'd like you to tell me yourself." Ethan took the card. Well, Rachel had positioned Lucy at the base of the ramp and was watching the sedan get winched up onto the flatbed with the weary attention of someone calculating costs. The tow driver had quoted her a number that she hadn't argued with, which meant it was probably too high, and she'd decided the morning had used up all her available argument. She noticed Reynolds when he moved. He walked around the truck to check the chain connection, a habit, and the motion pulled her attention. She looked at Ethan, a question in it. "Victor Reynolds," Ethan said. "He'd like to explain something. You don't have to stay." "I live here," Rachel said, meaning Silver Ridge, meaning she was going to be at the receiving end of whatever this was, meaning she had stakes in this conversation that Ethan didn't. "I'll stay." Reynolds introduced himself to Rachel with the brevity of someone who had explained himself to many people and had learned to lead with what mattered. He outlined the program in 3 minutes. Veteran intervention, service animal presence, community application, schools and public spaces, the funding that existed and the political will that had already been secured, the one gap. Rachel listened. She was still wearing her scrubs under the unzipped coat, and she had the look of someone who had been up since 4 in the morning and was running on the particular clarity that sometimes arrives on the other side of exhaustion. Sharper, not duller, everything simplified to what actually matters. "And you need what exactly?" she asked when Reynolds finished. "I need handlers. People who have the instinct and the animals who have the training. I need them in schools, in community centers, in environments where children like your daughter—" He paused, the only time he had paused, and Ethan heard in that pause a man who was choosing words carefully because he understood the weight of what he was asking and respected the people he was asking it of. Where children who are targeted encounter a presence that changes the calculation before the cruelty becomes the crisis. Lucy had been listening. She was very good at it. The kind of quiet, wide-eyed listening that children do when they sense adults are discussing something that directly concerns them and have decided for once not to ask them to leave. "Shadow could do that," she said. All 3 adults looked at her. "At school," she said. "If Shadow was there?" She looked at Ethan with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to qualify her requests with apology. "Do you think he'd want to?" Ethan looked at the dog. Shadow was sitting beside the wheelchair, shoulder to wheel, watching the sedan get loaded with mild professional interest. His tail moved once, slowly, at being looked at. "He's not big on retirement," Ethan said. Well, the sedan went up on the flatbed. The tow driver climbed back into the cab. Rachel had arranged for them to ride to Silver Ridge in the truck's extended cab. A tight fit with the wheelchair, but manageable. And the driver had said yes in the uncomplicated way of people from small towns who understand that bad mornings happen and you help. Rachel looked at Ethan. "You're heading south," she said. "That's the plan." "Silver Ridge is north." She said it factually, without pressure. "But the program Reynolds is describing, if it's going to Silver Ridge, that's where Lucy is. That's where I am. I'd rather it be someone I've met than someone I haven't." Ethan considered that. It was a practical statement dressed as a practical statement, which was the most honest kind. No appeal to sentiment, no manipulation, just, here's the geometry of the situation as I see it. Reynolds had stepped back, giving the conversation its space. I have an apartment in Durango, Ethan said. You can drive 4 hours, Rachel said. You're pushy for someone whose car just died. It's been a pushy morning. She looked at him steadily. 2 hours with Reynolds, that's all he's asking. That's all anyone's asking, Ethan said, all of a sudden, very loudly. You sat down at my daughter's table, Rachel said, and her voice was quiet now, very quiet. The noise of the flatbed winch in the background and the dry snow coming down and the exit sign still flickering above the diner door. Nobody asked you to do that. You just did it because it was the right thing to do. Ethan said nothing. I'm just asking you to keep doing the right thing. He looked at the card in his hand. Victor Reynolds, Colorado Veterans Community Coalition, Colorado Springs. A phone number with a 719 area code. He looked at Lucy, who had gone back to watching the sedan with the pragmatic interest of a child who has processed the morning's events and filed them and is now simply observing what comes next. He looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at him. Patient. Waiting. Ready, if ready was required, and not particularly concerned if it wasn't. The call came through at 9:47. Reynolds' phone. He stepped away to take it, and his body language changed within the first 5 seconds, in a way Ethan clocked immediately. The slight forward orientation, the left hand coming up to shade his eyes despite there being no sun, both tells of a person receiving information that requires their full attention. He came back to the group with his phone at his side and his face rearranged around something. There's a complication, he said. Rachel said, What kind? The footage Gary sent to Thomas. Thomas shared it with 3 people in our network for assessment purposes. Reynolds paused. One of them had a larger network than we'd accounted for. It's already out, Ethan said. Reynolds didn't insult him by hedging. It's been posted to 2 platforms in the last 20 minutes. As of this call, it has 47,000 views and it's moving. The parking lot was quiet except for the flatbed's idling engine and the distant sound of highway traffic. Rachel looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow was looking at the highway. 47,000 people who had watched 37 seconds of a gray-muzzled German shepherd walk across a diner and sit down between a frightened child and the people frightening her and had decided that was something worth passing on. 47,000 individual decisions to press a button. 47,000 reasons the Durango apartment was about to become a very complicated thing to return to. Ethan folded the card in half and put it in his jacket pocket. Where in Silver Ridge? He asked Reynolds. Reynolds blinked. I'm sorry? The program. If you're testing it in Silver Ridge, where? What building? Reynolds recovered fast. The middle school has already expressed interest. There's a community center on Lincoln. The hospital, he glanced at Rachel, has a pediatric wing. Rachel was very still. The pediatric wing, Ethan said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The flatbed's engine shifted into gear. The tow driver rolled down his window and called back to Rachel that he was ready. Lucy looked up at Ethan from the wheelchair with no expression he could name. Not hope, not expectation, just the open, undefended face of a child waiting to see what an adult was going to decide. There were things Ethan was not good at, and he knew the list. Paperwork, explaining himself, staying in a room after the need for him had passed, believing that what he was enough for the kind of life civilians led, with their routines and their social mathematics and their conversations about things that happened in offices. There were things he was good at, and the list was shorter. Reading a room, reading a dog, being still in a situation that wanted movement, understanding that the most disruptive thing you could do in a theater of low-grade cruelty was refuse to look away. He'd had those skills his entire adult life, and had never once used them for anything that didn't involve a uniform and a rifle. He unfolded the card, looked at the phone number, and put it back in his pocket without folding it this time. I'll follow you up, he said to Rachel. Rachel nodded once. That was all. Just the nod. No relief on her face, no victory, because she was too tired and too practical for either. She turned the wheelchair and began moving toward the flatbed. Shadow fell into step at Ethan's left shoulder. and together they crossed the parking lot while the dry snow came down and the exit sign above the diner door went on flickering, and it crossed Ethan's mind not for the first time that the things that needed fixing were rarely the ones anyone got around to fixing, and that you couldn't wait for someone else to do it, because there was no someone else. There was just the room you were standing in and the thing that was happening in it. And whether or not you were willing to sit down, the drive north to Silver Ridge took 40 minutes. Ethan followed the flatbed at a distance, close enough to keep the taillights in sight through the thickening snow, far enough back to give himself room to think. Shadow rode in the passenger seat the way he always did, upright, attentive, watching the road with the mild authority of a dog who had decided long ago that passenger seat meant co-pilot and intended to take the responsibility seriously. The highway curved through the canyon with the Pikes Peak Massif, somewhere invisible above them to the left, buried in cloud. The canyon walls were sandstone and pine, and the road had that particular quality of Colorado two-lane in January, passable, but making you aware of the conditions constantly, keeping you honest about speed. Ethan drove with both hands on the wheel, which was not his habit on clear roads, and kept the truck in the flatbed's tire tracks where the pavement was least compromised. Reynolds was somewhere behind him. They had exchanged numbers in the parking lot with the transactional efficiency of two people who understood that everything that needed to be said had already been said and the remaining logistics could wait. Ethan thought about 47,000 views. He tried to do the math of what that meant. Not emotionally, just practically. The way you calculated exposure on a patrol. How far has the information traveled? Who has it now? What decisions will be made because of it? The answer to the third question was the one he didn't have, and not having it was the thing that sat in his chest like a stone. He had spent 12 years in environments where information moved and you understood the consequences of its movement. He had no framework for the civilian version of that equation, where a video could cross the country in 20 minutes, and the consequences were entirely outside your control, and everyone called it good news. He turned the heater up. Shadow put his nose against the vent, then withdrew it. "I know," Ethan said. "Poka." Silver Ridge was a town of 11,000 people arranged on a high valley floor between two ridge lines, the kind of place that had been a mining town once, and was now the kind of place that people drove through on their way to ski resorts and occasionally stopped in and decided to stay, for reasons they could not always fully articulate, but generally had to do with the pace. Main Street was 8 blocks of 2-story brick buildings, a hardware store, 2 coffee shops, a diner that was not the Silver Ridge Sunrise but tried to look like it, a public library that had recently been renovated and was very proud of the fact, and a hospital at the north end of town that served 3 counties. Rachel had texted him the shop address while they were still on the highway. He met them at Ridge Auto, which was on the south end of town in a converted warehouse that smelled of motor oil and coolant and the particular metallic cold of an unheated workspace in January. The sedan was already off the flatbed and in a bay, and a mechanic named Hector with a gray ponytail and glasses pushed up on his forehead was looking under the hood with the expression of a man reading bad news. "Alternator," he said, without looking up. "She's been running on the battery for a while. You're lucky you made it to where you stopped and not the middle of the pass." Rachel looked at the engine with the expression of someone doing math they hadn't budgeted for. "How long?" "If I have the part, tomorrow afternoon. If I have to order it, Thursday." "Order it," Rachel said. Hector nodded, made a note, and disappeared into a back office. The tow driver had already left. Rachel looked at the car for a moment. Just the car, nothing else. Ethan had the sense she was doing the kind of private recalculation that people did when a cost arrived that wasn't catastrophic, but was close enough to require reorganization, and she was doing it without letting it show, which took a specific kind of practiced composure. "I have a shift at 4, she said to no one in particular. "We can walk to the apartment from here, it's 4 blocks. "I can drive you," Ethan said. "We're fine." She said it without sharpness, just clarity, the reflexive self-sufficiency of someone who had been handling things alone for long enough that accepting help required a beat of deliberate override. Then she looked at him and added, more honestly, "Thank you. But it's 4 blocks and Lucy needs the air." He nodded. Lucy, who had been examining the hood of the sedan with the diagnostic interest of someone who intended to understand how things broke, looked up. "Are you staying?" "For a bit," Ethan said. "For the meeting with Colonel Reynolds?" "For that? And then?" He looked at her. 9 years old, brown eyes, the directness of a child who had already learned that vague answers from adults usually meant no. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the honest answer. She appeared to weigh it, the way she weighed things, briefly, seriously, then arriving at a conclusion. "Shadow should stay too," she said. "He likes it here." Shadow was sitting on the concrete floor of the garage bay, watching Hector's feet under the sedan. His tail moved once at his name. "He's not particular," Ethan said. "He looks particular." "He looks whatever he needs to look." Rachel put her hand on the back of Lucy's wheelchair and tilted it slightly to negotiate the door threshold. "Lucy, we need to let Mr. Mercer get to his meeting." "It's Ethan," Lucy said to Rachel. "Not Ethan. It's Mr. Mercer until he says otherwise." Lucy looked at Ethan. "Ethan's fine," he said. Rachel gave him a look that was approximately 60% exasperation and 40% something else, then maneuvered the wheelchair through the door and out into the snow. Reynolds called at 11:15 and gave him an address. Not the community center on Lincoln, not the middle school, but a conference room in the hospital's administrative wing, which Ethan thought said something about how Reynolds operated. He would have chosen a neutral space if he'd been managing optics. He chose a hospital, which meant he wanted to establish context, and the context he wanted was, this is where vulnerable people come, and this is what a gap in protection looks like. The hospital was a 4-story building that smelled like all hospitals, which is to say, nothing specific and everything clinical. The administrative wing was a corridor off the main lobby with carpet instead of tile and small framed photographs of Silver Ridge taken in different decades on both walls, the town in various stages of being the town it was becoming. Reynolds was already in the conference room when Ethan arrived. 2 other people were with him. One was a woman in her 40s in a dark blazer. Posture, watchfulness, the kind of hands folded on the table stillness that meant either law or administration. The other was a man Ethan placed as a few years younger than Reynolds, in civilian clothes that fit better than Reynolds, with the particular tension of someone who had traveled to get here and was operating on less sleep than was ideal. Shadow entered the room before Ethan, swept the corners, and positioned himself to the left of Ethan's chair. Reynolds said, "Thank you for coming. This is Karen Osei. She's legal counsel for the coalition, and this is Dr. Paul Whitfield. He's our behavioral research lead." Ethan sat down. Shadow sat. Osei had an open laptop in front of her. On the screen was a freeze frame Ethan recognized. Shadow, mid-movement, crossing the diner floor. The timestamp in the corner read 070914. "How many now?" Ethan asked. Osei looked at her screen. "As of 20 minutes ago, 312,000 across both platforms. It's been picked up by 4 regional news aggregators and 1 national." Ethan absorbed that without expression. "There's an editorial going up this afternoon," Osei continued, in the neutral tone of someone delivering information they've been asked to deliver without commentary. "From a veterans advocacy publication out of Denver. They've identified the dog's designation from the harness patch. They don't have your name yet." "Yet," Ethan said. "Yet," she confirmed. Reynolds leaned forward. "I want to be clear about something before we go any further. You have options here, and I want you to understand all of them before you decide anything. Option 1. You say nothing, go to Durango, and we handle the public attention without your involvement. The footage is Gary's property. We cannot use your name or likeness without your consent. Full stop." "Option 2, Ethan said. "You participate in a limited capacity. We use your involvement as the proof of concept case study for the program launch. No press, no television, no public-facing role. You help us design the handler training component. We implement, you step back." "And 3, Reynolds sat back. "You come on board as a program advisor, part-time, compensated at a rate commensurate with your service experience. You work with me and Paul's team to develop the operational protocols. You help us identify and screen other handlers. You spend time here in Silver Ridge, in the schools, doing what you did this morning, on purpose." Whitfield, who had been quiet, said, "The behavioral data from this morning is extraordinary, Mr. Mercer. I don't mean that as flattery. I mean that what the footage shows, the combination of positioning, silence, and non-confrontational presence, achieved a de-escalation outcome that our modeled interventions in controlled environments have failed to replicate consistently." "Because it wasn't modeled," Ethan said. "Exactly. That's the problem we can't solve on paper. Whitfield put his hands flat on the table. We can train handlers. We can train the dogs. We cannot train the instinct that produces a genuine zero-aggression response to a genuine threat. It has to come from somewhere real. Ethan looked at the freeze frame on Osei's laptop. Shadow mid-stride, body low and calm, the diner's checkered floor underneath him, Lucy's wheelchair at the edge of the frame. I need to ask you something, Ethan said to Reynolds. Go ahead. Why a retired Marine sergeant? You have access to active duty handlers. You have working dog programs. You have organizations that have been doing animal-assisted intervention for 20 years. Why the man eating eggs in a diner? Reynolds didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. It meant the question was one he'd asked himself. Because the organizations doing animal-assisted intervention are coming from a therapeutic model, Reynolds said finally. Calm dogs in calm environments, working with pre-identified at-risk individuals in scheduled sessions. That's valuable. That's not what I need. What I need is the capacity to walk into an unscheduled situation, a diner, a school hallway, a parking lot, and be effective before the incident becomes a report. He paused. What you did this morning wasn't therapy. It was presence. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a program that helps people after they've been hurt and a program that prevents them from being hurt in the first place. Ethan looked at Shadow. Shadow looked back at him with his standard expression, which was, I have already made my decision whenever you're ready. I have an apartment in Durango I've never slept in, Ethan said. Leases can be broken, Osei said. I'm not asking for legal advice. I know, I'm offering it anyway. Something in the room shifted, not dramatically, just the slight reconfiguration of a space when the person in it has been assessed and has passed the assessment, and everyone knows it, but is too professional to say so. Check. Reynolds walked him through the program design over the next 90 minutes, with Whitfield filling in the behavioral research and Osei flagging legal architecture. It was more developed than Ethan had expected. Not a concept, not a proposal, an operational framework with tiered implementation, community consent protocols, handler wellness requirements, and a monitoring system that was, for a nonprofit initiative, genuinely sophisticated. Ethan asked questions. Not agreeable questions. Questions with edges, the kind designed to locate the weakest point in a structure and apply pressure. What's the protocol when a handler identifies a situation and the school administration disagrees with the assessment? Whitfield looked at Reynolds. Reynolds said, That's one of the gaps. So in practice, a handler calls it, administration overrides, and the intervention doesn't happen. And then what? The incident occurs and the handler files a report. That's the current default, yes. That's not a protocol. That's bureaucratic cover. Ethan looked at Reynolds directly. If you want this to function in a real environment, the handler needs clear authority to act within defined parameters regardless of institutional preference. Otherwise, you've built a program that looks good in a press release and gets overridden the first time a school principal is worried about optics. The room was quiet. He's right, Osei said, not looking up from her notes. Reynolds looked at Ethan. Not with offense, with the expression of a man who had been told something he already suspected and had been hoping someone would confirm out loud. You've dealt with this before. Chain of command with competing authorities is the oldest problem in any operational environment. You fix it in the planning phase or you get people hurt in the field. Ethan sat back. Define the handler's authority clearly in writing. Scope it tightly so it can't be abused. And build an incident review process that happens within 24 hours, every time, so there's accountability in both directions. Whitfield was writing. Can I ask you something? Reynolds said. You've been asking me things for an hour and a half. Something different. Reynolds folded his hands on the table. Your service record. 3 deployments, 12 years, honorable discharge. No disciplinary record, 2 commendations, the second one for an incident in Kandahar in 2019 that the details of are above my clearance level. He paused. You've been out for 14 months. You've done no work in the veteran transition space, no consulting, no advocacy. You drove to Denver for a meeting with a VA counselor and were driving home before 10 in the morning. He paused again. What have you been doing? Ethan said nothing. I'm not asking to pry, Reynolds said. I'm asking because if you come into this program, you'll be working with other veterans who are in various stages of figuring out the same thing. And I need to know if you have any ground to stand on when they look at you and ask how you did it. It was a better question than Ethan had expected. He sat with it for a moment, not defensively, but genuinely, because it deserved a genuine answer. I've been keeping the dog fed, he said, running him in the mornings, doing the things the discharge paperwork said to do. He looked at his hands on the table. I haven't figured it out. I'm 40 years old and I spent 12 years doing one thing and I was good at it, and now that thing is finished and I don't have a clean answer for what comes next. He looked at Reynolds. Is that a problem for your program? No, Reynolds said. It's a qualification. Whitfield nodded, still writing. The handlers I need are not people who have processed their service and arrived at peace, Reynolds said. Those people exist and they're valuable, but they're not the ones who can sit down at a table with a frightened kid and make her feel like someone sees what's happening. The ones who can do that are the ones who still know what it feels like to be in a room where you're invisible. He paused. Am I wrong? Ethan thought about the diner, about the specific quality of attention he'd paid to Lucy. Not pity, not strategy, just recognition. The recognition of a person who had spent considerable time in situations where the official version of what was happening and the actual version were two completely different things and had learned to read the gap. No, Ethan said. You're not wrong. They broke at 1 in the afternoon. Osei went to make calls. Whitfield left with 3 pages of notes he'd handwritten in a script that was nearly illegible and clearly meaningful to him. Reynolds and Ethan stood in the corridor outside the conference room, and Reynolds poured himself a coffee from a machine near the elevator that produced something hot and brown that both of them pretended was adequate. I need a week, Ethan said. For what? To decide. To actually decide, not just react to the momentum of the morning. He looked at the hallway, at the photographs of Silver Ridge in different decades, the same ridge lines in different buildings, the town in continuity. The footage is going to make this feel decided. It's not. Reynolds nodded. 1 week. I'll hold the advisor position. He sipped his coffee, grimaced at it. Where will you stay? I'll figure it out. There's a motel on 3rd Street. Tell them Victor sent you. The owner is a program supporter. She'll give you a rate. Ethan started to say he didn't need the rate, then didn't, because he wasn't sure that was true. Reynolds said, one more thing. Ethan stopped. The teenagers. From the diner. Reynolds looked at him with the measured expression of someone who had been carrying a piece of information and had decided this was the moment to release it. Thomas Vega tracked them down through the SUV registration. It's not illegal. The vehicle was visible in the footage. The plates were legible. Why would Thomas? Because that's his job. And because one of them is the son of a county commissioner in El Paso County who has been publicly opposed to the coalition's school access proposal for 3 months. Reynolds watched Ethan absorb that. It's relevant, not as leverage. I want to be very clear that we are not in the business of leverage. But it's relevant because the commissioner's office put out a statement 6 weeks ago arguing that veteran-facilitated programs in schools were a security risk. And now there is footage of his son using a wheelchair-dependent child as entertainment, while a veteran and a retired military dog prevent the escalation without a single act of aggression. Ethan was quiet. The commissioner has not made a public statement today, Reynolds said. His office has gone quiet. I don't know what he does next. I do know that the governor's legislative aide called Thomas at noon and asked for a briefing. This got political, Ethan said. It was already political. It just got visible. Ethan looked at the coffee machine, at his cup. It was truly bad coffee. He drank it anyway. Is there anything I should know about the commissioner? He's not a bad man, Reynolds said, with the specific inflection of someone making an honest assessment of a political adversary. He's a man who had a position and said it publicly and is now in a situation where the facts are inconvenient. What he does with that tells you something about him. And if he doubles down, then we have documentation, we have footage, we have a 9-year-old girl and her mother who will talk to anyone who asks, and we have a program that is better positioned than it was yesterday. Reynolds put his cup down. And if he reconsiders, we have an opportunity to build something that crosses a political line that has been difficult to cross. Ethan thought about that, about the specific institutional logic of it, how one morning in one diner in one small Colorado town could become, through a camera and a phone network, and the particular chemistry of public attention, The thing that moves a bureaucratic object that has been sitting still for 3 months. He had spent 12 years in environments where a single event could change the entire tactical picture. He had just not expected to experience that principle at a diner breakfast. "What do you need from me this week?" Ethan asked. "Nothing. Rest. Think. Bring the dog." "He's always here." "I know." Reynolds allowed himself a small expression that was almost a smile. That was the point. Ote. Shadow was waiting in the truck. He had been in the truck for 90 minutes and was not visibly distressed about this, because Shadow was not a dog who wasted energy on distress that didn't serve a function. He was sitting upright in the passenger seat, watching the hospital entrance with the alert patience of a dog who had learned that waiting was simply another form of being ready. Ethan climbed in. The truck was cold. He started it and let it run. His phone had 7 missed calls and 43 text messages, which was more human contact than he'd received in the previous 2 weeks combined. Most of the calls were numbers he didn't recognize. One was from a Colorado Springs area code. One was from a 202 prefix, Washington, D.C., which he looked at for a long time before setting the phone face down on the console. He sat in the running truck with the heater struggling back to life, and the snow coming down outside and Shadow's shoulder warm against his right arm, where the dog had shifted to press against him, the way Shadow did when he had decided that proximity was what the situation required and was not asking permission. The footage number would be higher now. He didn't check. He sat with the specific weight of a decision that wasn't made yet, but had already changed the shape of the space around it, the way a load-bearing decision always did. You could feel its mass before you committed to it, feel the way the room reorganized itself in anticipation. He thought about the Kandahar incident that was above Reynolds' clearance level, not what happened. He knew what happened. I thought about what it had cost, and what it had clarified, and why 12 years of service had ended the way it ended, and why he had driven north from Denver that morning before the sun came up on an empty highway with a dog and a folder of resources, and nothing particular to go back to. He thought about a girl in a purple coat who held a red crayon with both hands. He thought about what Reynolds had said. They're not the ones who can sit down at a table with a frightened kid and make her feel like someone sees what's happening. He had sat down. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't a decision he'd arrived at through reasoning. He'd stood up and crossed the room and sat down because something in him that was below the level of deliberation had said, "This is the situation, and you are the person who is here, and not being here is not a choice you can make." 12 years of service, and he'd never once been able to explain that mechanism to anyone who asked. Why you stayed in environments that cost you things. Why you didn't leave when leaving was available and logical, and most people would have understood. The truck had warmed up enough to be bearable. He picked up his phone, opened a text message to a number he didn't have saved but recognized. Rachel Hale's number from the earlier exchange. He typed, "Staying a week. Reynolds has a motel. Is Lucy's school the middle school on—" He paused, didn't know the address, deleted the last clause, and just wrote, "Does Lucy go to the middle school here?" The answer came back in under a minute. "Yes, Jefferson Middle. Why?" He typed, "Reynolds wants to pilot the program there. I wanted to know if she'd be there." A longer pause this time. He watched the snow. "She will. You should know she talked about Shadow for the entire 4 blocks. She's going to ask every day when she can see him again." He looked at the dog. "He'll be around," he typed. He set the phone down and put the truck in drive. The motel on 3rd Street was 3 blocks from the hospital. The owner was a woman named Pat, who was 60-something and brisk, and showed him to a room that was clean and had a view of the ridgeline and didn't charge extra for the dog. And when he thanked her, she said, "Victor said you might be useful," with the particular phrasing of someone who had seen Victor Reynolds produce useful things before and was reserving full judgment until the evidence came in. He let Shadow into the room first. Shadow swept the corners, checked the bathroom, and chose the spot between the bed and the window, which had always been his spot, in every room they'd shared for as long as Ethan could remember. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. He thought about the DC number. He thought about the commissioner's office going quiet. He thought about the governor's aide calling Thomas Vega at noon. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a while. Not in distress exactly, but in the private space that you needed sometimes. The space between what had happened and what came next, where you were allowed for a moment to not know what you were doing and not have to explain it to anyone. Shadow put his chin on Ethan's knee. Ethan put his hand on the dog's head. Outside, the snow continued without opinion or agenda, covering the parking lot and the ridge and the highway south, softening the geometry of everything, making the world briefly simpler than it was. He had 1 week. He'd figure out what to do with it. I didn't sleep well the first night. That wasn't new. Sleep had been negotiated territory for a long time, something he managed rather than experienced, tracking the hours with the same low-grade vigilance he applied to most things. He lay on top of the motel bed covers at first, still dressed, watching the ceiling, listening to the snow against the window and the occasional low sound of a truck on the highway 2 blocks over. Shadow breathed steadily in his spot between the bed and the wall. At some point, Ethan got under the covers. At some later point, it was light outside. He ran in the morning. Shadow ran beside him through Silver Ridge in the pre-dawn quiet, both of them adjusting to the altitude, which at 8,000 feet made the first half-mile more honest than comfortable. The town was still mostly asleep, a light on in a bakery window, a man scraping ice off a windshield on 2nd Street without particular urgency, a cat watching them from a porch railing with the comprehensive indifference of a creature that had made its peace with all possible outcomes. The ridgelines were visible in the early light, the snow on them fresh and total, and the town below them had that specific quality of smallness that wasn't belittling. It was just accurate. The appropriate size of a human settlement relative to the mountains that had been there before it and would be there after. Ethan ran 4 miles, came back, showered, and looked at his phone. The footage had passed 1.2 million views overnight. The DC number had called again. He looked at it for a long time, then called it back. The person who answered was a congressional aide named Marcus, who was professional and efficient and told Ethan in the first 45 seconds that a member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee had seen the footage and wanted a conversation. Not a hearing, not testimony, a conversation. Informal, at Ethan's convenience. "I'll think about it," Ethan said. "Of course. Here's my direct number." "I have it," Ethan said. "It's why I called you back." He hung up and made coffee from the motel's single-serve machine, which was better than the hospital corridor machine and worse than everything else, and sat in the chair by the window and watched the ridgeline come fully into the morning light. He thought about what Reynolds had said. It was already political. It just got visible. He called Reynolds at 8. "The congressional aide," Ethan said. "I know about Marcus. I got a call from his office yesterday afternoon." And I told him the same thing I'm telling you. This program needs to be built before it gets put in front of a camera. If we go to Washington with a concept and footage, we get attention. If we go with a functioning pilot program and documented outcomes, we get funding and legislation. Reynolds paused. But that requires a pilot, and a pilot requires Silver Ridge to work. How long for a pilot? 3 months minimum, 6 for meaningful data. Ethan looked at the ridgeline. "I told you I needed a week." "You did." "I've had 1 night. That's not a week." "No," Ethan said, "it's not." He set down his coffee cup. "Jefferson Middle School. What does their administration look like?" Reynolds was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to understand the question, short enough to not make it into something it wasn't. "Principal named Diane Croft. She's been there 11 years. She's the one who reached out to us 3 months ago about the proposal. Before the commissioner's office opposed it. 6 weeks before. She's been patient." "Does she know I'm in town?" "I told her this morning." "Of course you did," Ethan said. "She'd like to meet with you. Her terms, not mine. She specifically said she didn't want it to feel like a sales meeting. She suggested coffee. Off campus." "When?" "She said whenever worked for you." Ethan looked at Shadow, who was sitting by the window watching the street below with the alert calm of a dog fully committed to his morning's work. "Today at 10, he said. "Pick a place." Diane Croft was not what he'd expected, which he recognized as a failure of assumption on his part. He'd built a version of her from the word principal and the fact that she'd made the first contact. Organized, careful, institutional. What he got was a 52-year-old woman in jeans and a wool sweater, drinking black coffee at a corner table in one of Silver Ridge's coffee shops, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the look of someone who had heard too many good ideas that went nowhere and was deciding in real time how to categorize this one. She looked at Shadow when they came in, not with surprise, with assessment. "Does he need anything?" she asked. "He's fine," Ethan said. "There's water in the back." I asked. He appreciated that she'd asked. He sat down across from her and Shadow positioned himself under the table, which was his preference in enclosed civilian spaces, contained, present, monitoring without being visible to everyone in the room. I've watched the footage, Croft said, without preamble. 4 times. The 4th time I watched it without sound because I wanted to see the body language without the ambient audio interpreting it for me. What did you see? I saw a dog make a better call than most adults in that room. She said it without self-pity or drama, just accuracy. I've been a principal for 11 years. I have watched more incidents in more hallways than I can count. And in about 60% of them, there was an adult in the vicinity who saw the early signal and decided it wasn't their responsibility. Ethan said nothing, but something in his posture changed. What Reynolds is proposing, she continued, is not a magic solution. I want to be clear that I know that. You can't put a veteran and a dog in a school and expect the culture to shift overnight. The kids who do what those teenagers did in that diner. They don't stop because there's a new presence in the building. They adapt. They move it somewhere the presence isn't. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. What I'm interested in is whether the presence changes the bystanders. How do you mean? The people who saw it in the diner, the truck driver, the couple at the counter, the waitress. None of them acted until something changed the permission structure. She looked at him. You changed the permission structure, not by confronting anyone, by sitting down and not leaving, and the room watched you do it and recalibrated. She paused. I've been trying to figure out how to teach that. How to teach students, not the ones doing harm. I've mostly given up on reaching them through school-based intervention. How to teach the bystanders that they have permission to act. And the dog makes that easier. The dog makes everything easier. The dog is a permission structure all by himself. She said it with the directness of an educator who had spent a decade watching children give animals access to their attention that they'd never give an adult. You walk into a hallway with that dog, and the 5 students who saw something happen yesterday and said nothing. 3 of them will come to you. Not because you're a veteran, not because of the footage, because of the dog. And then you listen, and then something can be done. Ethan sat with that. I'm not asking you to be a counselor, Croft said. I have 2 licensed counselors and neither of them has enough hours. I'm asking you to be present and to bring him. She glanced down at the table where Shadow's tail was visible at the edge. 3 days a week, unscheduled. I don't want it to feel like a program. I want it to feel like part of the environment. Reynolds calls it presence intervention. Reynolds writes grant proposals. I'd call it having someone in the building who pays attention. She looked at him. Can you do that? He looked at his coffee. I haven't agreed to the program yet. I know. Reynolds told me you needed a week. She picked up her cup. I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm asking you to come walk the building. Today, if you're willing. See what the environment looks like before you decide. She set the cup down. Because I think if you see it, you'll know. He looked at her for a moment, then at Shadow. Shadow had come out from under the table and was sitting beside his chair, looking at Diane Croft with the mild, attentive expression he reserved for people he had provisionally decided were worth his attention. After this coffee, Ethan said. Jefferson Middle School was a 2-story brick building from the 1970s that had been updated in ways that were visible mainly by contrast. New windows in old frames, a fresh roof that didn't match the facade, a gymnasium addition that was architecturally incompatible and clearly necessary. The halls were wide and the ceilings were low, and the lockers were the specific shade of green that school lockers had always been, and apparently always would be. Croft walked him through during the morning break when the halls filled with controlled chaos. 700, 12, and 13-year-olds navigating 3 minutes between classes, their noise and motion and social weather filling every available cubic foot of space. Shadow walked at Ethan's left shoulder, and the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The first cluster of kids they passed, 4 7th graders at a locker bank, mid-argument about something, stopped talking. Not because they were afraid, because the dog. 2 of them instinctively stepped toward Shadow before catching themselves and looking at Ethan for permission. He's friendly, Ethan said. Both of them dropped to a crouch. Shadow accepted the attention with professional grace, allowing the contact, not initiating it, his tail moving in the slow, measured way that meant he was present and receptive but not performing. The third kid in the group, a boy who hadn't moved, who was standing slightly apart with his arms folded, and a posture that Ethan recognized immediately as the cultivated casualness of someone who had learned not to want things openly, watched Shadow for a moment and then looked at Ethan. "Is he trained?" the boy asked. "Yes." "For what?" "Patrol, detection, room entry, some other things." "Military?" "Marines." The boy unfolded his arms. It was a small thing, barely visible, but he took one step forward. "My uncle was Army." "Good branch," Ethan said. "That's not what my uncle says about Marines." "Your uncle's probably right. We're difficult." Something shifted in the boy's face. Not a smile, not all the way, but the ghost of one. He looked at Shadow. "Can I—" "Go ahead." He crouched down and put his hand out, and Shadow sniffed it and then leaned his head slightly into the contact, and the boy's whole posture reorganized around that. The folded arms, the careful distance, the studied indifference, all of it reconfigured by the simple weight of a dog's head against his hand. Croft was watching from 3 feet back. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They kept walking. By the end of the week, Ethan had walked the building 4 times. He had met Croft's 2 counselors, a young woman named Simone, who was sharp and overextended and welcomed him with the exhausted gratitude of someone who had been managing 140 case files with tools designed for 60, and an older man named Roy, who was more cautious, who asked specific and intelligent questions about Shadow's training and Ethan's operational history, and took 2 days to arrive at a position of provisional support, which Ethan respected more than immediate enthusiasm. He had met, on the 3rd walkthrough, a girl named Jade, who was 13 and had been eating lunch alone in the library for 6 weeks, following a social rupture that Roy had described in general terms as typical of that age group, and that Simone had described more specifically as targeted and documented and difficult to address within existing school policy. Jade had not spoken to Ethan. She'd spoken to Shadow for approximately 11 minutes in a low voice, sitting cross-legged on the library floor while Shadow lay beside her with his head in her lap and his eyes closed. And when she left, she didn't say goodbye to Ethan, just to the dog, by name, which meant she'd read the harness. He had eaten dinner twice at the same Thai restaurant on Main Street that was better than it had any reason to be at that altitude. He had talked to Rachel once, briefly, in the hospital parking lot when he ran into her coming off a shift at 7 in the morning, both of them slightly wrecked by the hour and the cold, and she'd told him Lucy had asked about Shadow every day. He'd told her to bring Lucy to the school the following Tuesday, which was when Reynolds had scheduled the formal pilot launch. He had not called the D.C. number again. He had called his landlord in Durango and had a conversation that cost him 2 months of rent he'd never get back and resolved the lease question. On Friday afternoon, he called Reynolds. "I'm in," he said. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Not surprised, Ethan thought, but taking the moment seriously enough not to rush past it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. I have conditions." "I'd be worried if you didn't." Ethan listed them. Handler authority clearly defined in writing before any school access. A direct reporting line to Reynolds that bypassed institutional middle layers. Shadow's health and welfare protocols set by a vet of Ethan's choosing, not the program's. A 6-month review with mutual opt-out if either party decided the arrangement wasn't working. No press, no photography, no use of Shadow's image in program promotional materials without explicit consent for each specific use. Reynolds agreed to all of it. "One more thing," Ethan said. "Go ahead." "The commissioner." "Hartley." Reynolds paused. "What about him?" "Has he made a statement yet?" "His office issued something Wednesday. It was carefully worded. He didn't reverse his position on the program, but he walked back the security risk language and replaced it with questions about implementation." Reynolds paused. "In political terms, that's a significant movement." "Has anyone talked to him directly?" "Not from our side. We've been letting the footage do the work." Ethan thought about it. About what Reynolds had said. Not a bad man, just a man who had a position and the facts became inconvenient. He thought about the specific cost of being publicly wrong and the different costs of different responses to that condition. "I'd like to," he said, "to talk to him." "Yes." Reynolds was quiet again, longer this time. "That's not part of the program design." "I know, it's not a program thing, it's a—" He stopped, looking for the right word. "There's a gap between what he said
and what he now knows is true. If nobody acknowledges that gap with him directly, he fills it in with something that protects the position. If someone acknowledges it without attacking him, he might fill it in differently. You think you can do that? I don't know. But I spent 12 years talking to people in rooms where everyone's position was non-negotiable and things still moved, sometimes. He paused. I'm not going to tell him his son is a bad person. I'm going to tell him what I saw in that diner, which is that 4 kids in a room with no one watching them did something they wouldn't have done if someone had been watching. And that's a resource problem, not a character problem. And his opposition to the program is making the resource problem worse. He may not receive it. He may not. But I'd rather try than let it sit. Commissioner Dale Hartley's district office was in Colorado Springs, an hour and 40 south on I-25. Ethan drove down on Saturday morning, Shadow in the passenger seat, the mountains to the west still carrying the week's snow in long white diagonals on the upper slopes. The office was in a low office park near the interstate, not the kind of location that signaled power, the kind that signaled accessibility, which told Ethan something about how Hartley had built his career. The receptionist, a young man named Travis, looked at Shadow with the slightly panicked expression of someone who has not been told to expect a German shepherd and is calculating whether this falls within his authority to handle. He's a retired service animal, Ethan said. He'll stay in the waiting area if the commissioner prefers. The commissioner, it turned out, did not prefer. He came out of his office within 3 minutes of Travis relaying the visitor's name, which meant Reynolds or someone had made a call ahead, or Hartley had been following the situation closely enough to know the name when he heard it, and either possibility was informative. Dale Hartley was 60, with the build of someone who had been athletic 30 years ago and hadn't entirely let it go. He had the handshake of a man who had given a lot of handshakes and understood them as communication. He looked at Shadow first, then at Ethan, and his face was doing the work of a man who understood that this meeting had a particular weight and was deciding in real time how to carry it. Mr. Mercer, he said, come in. His office was ordered without being sterile, a working space with stacked files and 2 monitors and a window that looked out at the parking lot and the interstate beyond it. He'd put a chair on the visitor's side that had more room beside it than necessary, which meant he or Travis had moved something in the last 3 minutes, which meant he'd decided before Ethan arrived that the dog would be coming in. He sat down. Ethan sat across from him. Shadow settled on the floor between them, equidistant, which was either neutral or symbolic depending on how you read it. I owe you an apology, Hartley said. Ethan hadn't expected that. He'd prepared for defense, for the managed conversation of a man protecting a position, not for this. Not to me specifically, Hartley continued, to the idea, to the program. He put his elbows on the desk and folded his hands and looked at them for a moment. I said things publicly about veteran-facilitated programs in schools that I believed at the time were reasonable caution. I was using a framework that was about risk management, and I applied it to something that, in that framework, looked like an unknown variable. And now, Ethan said, now I watched a video 1.7 million times. Not me personally. I watched it 4 times. And I have a son who I need to have a conversation with that I should have had a long time ago. He looked up from his hands. That conversation is not your business, and I'm not telling you about it to create sympathy. I'm telling you because you should know it's happening, because it's part of the picture. Ethan was quiet. What is it you came to say? Hartley asked. Because it wasn't to receive an apology. You didn't know I had one ready. No, Ethan said. I came to tell you what I saw. The footage is 37 seconds. I was there for 2 hours. Ethan looked at him. Your son isn't a monster. None of those kids are. They're kids who were in a room where the social permission structure said that what they were doing was acceptable, and nobody was challenging that. The moment that structure changed, they stopped. Hartley was listening with his full attention. The way people listened when they were receiving information, they were simultaneously relieved to hear and ashamed to need. The program isn't about catching bad kids, Ethan said. It's about changing the room. If the room has a different structure, if there's a presence that makes it clear that everyone is visible, that cruelty doesn't have the cover of inattention, then the kids who would have done what those 4 did in that diner don't do it. Not because they're afraid of punishment, because the room doesn't invite it. Hartley sat back in his chair and looked at the window.
The interstate traffic moved behind the glass, indifferent and continuous. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Not opposition," Ethan said. "That's all. You don't have to support it publicly. You don't have to revise your statement. Just stop applying the risk framework to something it doesn't fit. Let the pilot run." Hartley looked at him for a long moment. "I have a constituent in Silver Ridge," he said. "Diane Croft. She's been emailing my office for 3 months about this. I know who she is. She's going to get my personal number on Monday." He said it flatly, as a statement of a decision already made. "I'm not going to become the program's champion. I have positions I've taken that I need to manage carefully. But the opposition is finished." Ethan stood up. Hartley stood with him. He looked at Shadow again, with the expression of a man looking at something that had functioned as evidence against him and was trying to arrive at a fair relationship with it. "He's something," Hartley said. "He is," Ethan agreed. "Does he know what he did? For the program, I mean. The footage." Ethan looked at the dog. "He knows what he did in the diner. Everything else. That's our version of events." Hartley almost smiled. "Fair point." They shook hands at the door and Ethan walked back through the waiting room past Travis, who was pretending to look at his computer, and out into the parking lot and the cold. The pilot launched on Tuesday. Not with a press event, not with a ceremony. Reynolds had agreed to Ethan's conditions, which meant no cameras, no promotional documentation, nothing that would make Jefferson Middle School feel like a demonstration. It launched with Ethan and Shadow walking through the front door at 8:15 in the morning, signing in at the main office the way anyone would, and beginning the day. Croft had told the staff on Friday. She'd told the students nothing, because telling students nothing was usually the correct approach. Presence speaks for itself, and an announced presence is a performance, and a performance is not the same thing as a reality. The reality was Shadow in the hallway between second and third period, and the 7 students who stopped to interact, including the boy with the uncle in the army whose name was Marcus, a coincidence Ethan noted and said nothing about, and including Jade, who came out of the library at exactly the moment Shadow passed the door and knelt down in the hallway without self-consciousness and let Shadow put his head against her shoulder. The reality was Roy, the cautious counselor, standing in his office doorway at lunch watching Ethan sit in the hallway outside the cafeteria, and coming out after 10 minutes to lean against the wall beside him in the specific posture of a person who has decided to be present without discussing why, and the two of them standing there together without talking, while Shadow watched the cafeteria door and students moved in and out, and one 7th grader stopped and said, "Cool dog," and kept walking, and one 6th grader stopped and said, "Is he military?" And Ethan said, "Retired," and the kid said, "My mom is Air Force," and Ethan said, "Good branch," and the kid said, "Better than Marines," and Ethan said, "Don't push it," and the kid laughed and went into the cafeteria. The reality was Simone stopping Ethan in the corridor at the end of the day with a specific case she needed to think through out loud, not asking for a solution, just needing to say the thing to someone who would understand the weight of it, and Ethan listening, and Shadow sitting at Simone's feet the whole time with his eyes half closed. And when she finished, she said, "Thank you," and he said, "You're doing a hard job," and she said, "So are you." And they both went back to what they were doing. Rachel brought Lucy on Wednesday. She'd gotten approval from Croft for a brief visit, not a school event, just a child visiting the building after hours to see the dog. They came at 4 o'clock, when the building had mostly cleared out, and the light through the hallway windows was going gold and horizontal. Lucy came through the front door in her wheelchair, and Shadow was already moving before Ethan gave any signal, crossing the lobby, arriving at Lucy's chair, sitting beside her with his shoulder against the wheel in exactly the same position he'd held in the diner 2 weeks ago. Lucy's face did what it did when Shadow was there. It simply opened. "Hi," she said. To the dog. Not to Ethan. "Hi," Ethan said. She looked up. "You stayed." "I said I might." "You said you didn't know." "This is me knowing." She considered that, with the brief and serious consideration she gave everything. "Is Shadow going to be here at the school?" 3 days a week. "Which days?" "Monday, Tuesday, Thursday." "I go to school Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, and Friday," she said. "That's all of them." "I know." She looked at Shadow. "So, 3 out of 5. That's the math." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's pretty good." Rachel was standing a few feet back with her hands in her coat pockets,
watching her daughter with an expression that was composed of several things layered over each other: exhaustion, and underneath it gratitude, and underneath that something more complicated that had to do with the particular loneliness of parenting a child in a world that was regularly unkind, and the specific relief of a moment when the world was not. "She's been different," Rachel said quietly to Ethan, not loud enough for Lucy to hear. "Different how?" "She raised her hand in class last week. Her teacher emailed me." Rachel looked at her hands. "She's been in that school since September. She has never raised her hand." She paused. "Her teacher asked what changed, and Lucy said, 'I don't know. I just felt like it.'" Ethan looked at the girl in the purple coat, who was telling Shadow about the jaguar she'd finally finished coloring, orange with black spots, exactly as she'd decided. And she'd gone over the spots 3 times because she wanted them to be real spots, not just marks. And Shadow was listening with the deep and patient attention of a creature that understood that being listened to was not about comprehension, it was about recognition. "She felt like someone was paying attention," Ethan said. Rachel nodded. "That's what I thought." They stood there for a moment in the empty corridor, the late light coming through the windows, the school quiet around them, and Lucy's voice describing the jaguar in the coloring book with the specificity of a child who knew that the details were the point. 3 weeks after this pilot launched, Reynolds held a review meeting. It was not the formal 6-month review in Ethan's contract. It was the kind of check-in that happens in working programs when something is moving faster than the timeline anticipated and the people running it need to take stock. Whitfield had compiled preliminary behavioral data from Croft, from Simone and Roy, from the attendance records of the library in the weeks before and after Shadow's presence. The data was incomplete and early, and Whitfield said so explicitly, which Ethan appreciated. What it showed, even incomplete and early, was 7 documented bystander interventions in 3 weeks, where a student had reported or directly addressed a bullying incident rather than passing it, compared to 1 in the 3 weeks prior. The counselor's voluntary drop-in rate had increased. 3 students who had been eating alone in the library or the cafeteria were now eating with at least 1 other person. "You can't attribute all of that to the program," Whitfield said. "No," Ethan said. "You can't. But the correlation is there." "The correlation is there," Ethan agreed. Reynolds looked at the data and then at Ethan. "Marcus called again." "I know, he called me too." "And?" Ethan had been thinking about the DC number for 3 weeks, about what it meant to take something that had happened in a diner, something small and private and unremarkable in every way except what it had produced, and carry it into a room where it became evidence for a policy argument. The thing was, he'd already made the decision. He'd made it in the parking lot of the Silver Ridge Sunrise Diner when he followed the flatbed north. He'd made it when he called his landlord in Durango. He'd made it every morning when he ran through Silver Ridge and knew, without drama, that this was the place and this was the work. Taking it to Washington was a different thing, but the work was the work regardless of where the conversation happened. "Schedule it," he said. Reynolds nodded. "But Shadow comes," Ethan said. "He's not optional." He was never optional. The hearing, which was not a hearing officially, but was held in a committee room and had stenographers, so took place on a Thursday in March, 3 months after a man and a dog had breakfast at a diner in Colorado and sat down at the wrong table for exactly the right reasons. Ethan wore his service uniform. It was the first time he'd put it on since the discharge ceremony, and it fit the way things fit when they've been worn for years. Not perfectly, but correctly, the way a familiar weight settles. Shadow wore his retired MWD harness, the patch faded and the stitching showing its age, which was the point. They walked into the committee room, and the room did what rooms did when Shadow entered them. It paid attention. Ethan testified for 40 minutes. Not about what happened in the diner. Reynolds had advised against making the personal incident the center of the testimony, because it would become the story, and the story was not the argument. The argument was the argument. The data was early and incomplete, and he said so. The model was promising and needed a real operational environment to test, and he said that too. What he did not say, and did not need to say, because it was in the room with him, and had been since the moment they walked in, was, "This works, and this is what it looks like when it works, and you are looking at it right now." The committee chair, a woman from Colorado who had been in office for 11 years,
and had the steady, slightly weathered quality of a politician who had long since stopped caring about appearing to care and had started simply caring, asked him one question at the end that no one else had asked. "Mr. Mercer, why did you sit down?" The room was quiet. Ethan looked at Shadow, who was sitting beside his chair, and looking at the committee chair with the mild, professional attention he gave to everyone. "Because the room expected me not to," Ethan said. "The whole structure of what was happening depended on people deciding it was easier not to, and I've spent 12 years in environments where the easier decision gets people killed, so I sat down." He paused. "And Shadow moved because he's watched me do it long enough that he understood it was the right thing before I'd finished deciding." The chair looked at the dog. "He seems to know what he's doing," she said. "More than I do," Ethan said. "Most of the time." The program received federal pilot funding 4 months later. Not the full rollout. Not yet, but enough for 3 additional sites in Colorado and a 2-year data collection framework. Reynolds called Ethan from his car in a parking lot in Denver to tell him, and Ethan could hear in Reynolds' voice the specific quality of a man who has been working toward a thing for a long time and has reached the point where it becomes real, which is different from the point where it becomes good, and Reynolds understood the difference. "It's not finished," Reynolds said. "No," Ethan agreed, "but it started." "It was started in a diner on Highway 24, Ethan said, "by a dog." Reynolds laughed, a short, genuine sound. "I'll put that in the grant report." "Please don't." The diner fixed the exit sign sometime in February. Donna told Ethan when he stopped in for breakfast on his way back from Colorado Springs, 2 months after the morning that had started all of this. The repair was unremarkable, a new bulb, someone finally getting around to it. But the sign burned steadily now above the door, and the word exit was lit and clear and no longer flickering. Gary had kept the security camera footage backed up in 3 places. He had added 2 more cameras. He had also, without announcing it, started keeping Shadow's preferred water dish on the floor behind the counter for the next time. Lucy raised her hand in class every week now, not every day. She had opinions about when it was worth it and when it wasn't, and she was developing a fairly sophisticated sense of that distinction, which her teacher found mildly alarming and privately admirable. She had 3 friends by March, which was 3 more than she'd had in September, and on the days when Shadow was at the school, she found reasons to be in the hallways between periods rather than taking the faster interior routes. She never made a performance of it. She would just appear in whatever hallway Ethan was walking, and Shadow would alter course by about 2 degrees without being told, and they would move through the school together for a few minutes, the veteran, the dog, and the girl in the wheelchair. And the students who saw them developed, over weeks, a particular habit of moving slightly to create a path, not from obligation, but from the specific human instinct that arises when you are in the presence of something worth respecting. Rachel stopped waiting for the next hard thing in the way she always had, not without worry, but with a different quality of it, less braced, more inhabited. She still drove Lucy to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon, and she still ran through every contingency in the first 10 seconds when her phone buzzed unexpectedly. But there was a floor under it now that hadn't been there before, something that held. On a Tuesday in April, coming out of Jefferson Middle School, at the end of the day, Lucy stopped her wheelchair at the top of the entrance ramp and looked at the mountains. The snow had pulled back to the upper third of the ridgelines, and the lower slopes were showing the first tentative green of Colorado spring, and the sky above was the particular saturated blue that appeared at altitude after clear weather. Shadow sat beside her wheel and looked at the same ridgeline. "What do you think he's looking at?" Lucy asked. Ethan stood beside them, hands in his jacket pockets. "Same thing you are," he said. "How do you know?" "Because it's worth looking at." She considered that. Then, without preamble, in the way she always arrived at conclusions, "Are you going to stay? Like actually stay?" He looked at the ridgeline, at the green coming back into the lower slopes, at the town arranged in the valley below the mountains that had been there before it, patient and permanent. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to stay." She nodded, satisfied, in the way of someone who had already made peace with the answer and was waiting for him to catch up to it. They stood there for a while, the 3 of them, while the afternoon light moved across the valley and the school emptied around them, and Silver Ridge went about its ordinary business in the ordinary way of small towns that don't know they've become the place where something started. Nobody asked for anything. Nobody needed to.
The most dangerous thing you can do in a room where cruelty is happening is look away. The second most dangerous is to believe that standing up requires more than you have. Most of the time, all it takes is sitting down.